Hi, this is Dr. Peter Osborne, and I'm on conference with Sayer G. He is a health educator. Sayer, how are you doing tonight?
Oh, very good. Thank you.
I'm gonna not mangle your resume, and I'm just gonna ask you to give a background of where you're coming from and your experiences. And
Oh, great. Yeah. Okay. Well, I actually went to school at Rutgers for philosophy, and I am the son of a biochemist who teaches there, and my mother's a reference librarian. So a lot of what I've found myself doing at present is actually a combination of both features. When it comes to my experience with wheat intolerance and or celiac disease, I've been managing a health food store in Southwest Florida for 7 years, and we have been catering towards a gluten-free diet for about 20 of those years. Because we've been in business for 25 years. So that's where I've been exposed to quite a few people who have been suffering from wheat intolerance, and I've always been very interested in its relevance to those who may not have an explicit diagnosis of wheat intolerance. And also, one of the things I've spent a lot of time doing this past few years is producing a nonprofit database called greenmedinfo.com, and it has it's basically a filter of Medline studies which are relevant to natural medicine. The goal was to separate sort of the business end of this industry from the information and just make available clinical information on the benefits of natural substances.
And you said that was greenmedinfo.com?
Yes, greenmedinfo.com.
And so what are some of the things that you have on the site that can benefit people? What are some of the features?
Well, one of the things I've been doing is selecting biomedical citations that are relevant to wheat intolerance. So one of the things I found over the past year were a number of studies on a component of the wheat berry or seed, which is known as wheat germ agglutinin, or WGA. It's classified as a lectin, which is a type of anti-nutrient that helps to fend off predation from insects and fungi and mammals and humans. And I've been collating a lot of that research. So I do have a section that is called Problem Substances, and it contains, wheat, germ agglutinin, gliadin, and then there are other chemicals, just basic drugs, for instance. And so that's part of the project, although the bulk of the research is on things that are beneficial to our health. So that's part of what I've been doing with it.
And so can you kind of give us an overview of wheat germ agglutinin? Because, one of the things that a lot of patients that have been diagnosed with celiac disease or people that have the diagnosis of gluten sensitivity or gluten intolerance, the word is always about gluten, glutinous, glutenat, glutinous. And so I think there's a big kind of gap in what people actually understand as far as what some of these grains can do. And so give us some background on wheat germ agglutinin.
Yes, I'd be happy to. Well, that's one of the things that I've discovered is that I'll have a lot of people come in who've had antibody testing, let's say IgG antibody tests for intolerance to wheat, and one of the things they generally test for is gliadin, which is one of the proteins that we know is causative in the damage associated with celiac disease and other types of intolerances. But wheat germ agglutinin is a completely separate entity, and it isn't tested for generally. In fact, I don't know if there is a commercial test available for this lectin. Now, lectins are a class of glycoproteins, so they're part sugar, part protein. They're exceedingly small. So a kernel of wheat has maybe 1 microgram, extremely small amounts. And it's also very small in size. So technically 36 kilodaltons, which is 36,000 hydrogen atoms wide. In order to filter out things in our stomach, you can basically absorb up to 1,000 kilodalton size amino acid length. So, it's so small that it doesn't have any trouble getting through into systemic circulation. And, lectins come from the same etymological root as the word select. So they are designed to attach to very specific proteins. And the one that, there's two actually that it's designed to attach to are sialic acid, which is the slippery mucus coating that lines the gastrointestinal tract and, let's say, the sinuses. It's also found lining the arteries. And the second thing it attaches to is N-acetylglucosamine, which happens to be the building block beneath that first slippery mucus coating, which is very important because it's what the villi are composed of in the gastrointestinal tract. So you have this ingenious substance that is designed to cause inflammation in the gastrointestinal tract of the animal that would constitute its primary predator. We are the agrarian species. We have now populated a good portion of the planet's landmass with, monocultured grains such as wheat. So it's fascinating because obviously we have profound connection with this grain, and we've decided to invest massive amounts of energy and time in producing it. So, I can't say that, wheat germ agglutinin is killing us, but it is a very specific type of defense, and we know that it does go into systemic circulation. It can cross the blood-brain barrier. It attaches to glucosamine, which would also be part of the joint. It may explain why there's such a profound dependency on glucosamine in this country, and then NSAIDs, which are anti-inflammatory. So, I kind of said a lot, so I don't know if I should clarify any of that, Dr. Osborne.
Well, let me just back up and kind of give a brief summary of what I took away from it. What you're saying is that wheat germ agglutinin is a very small molecule.
Yes.
It can penetrate the gut, it can penetrate into the bloodstream, and it can create an inflammatory damage to tissues in the body.
Yeah.
And in so doing can create a lot of different reactions, maybe not even related to gluten itself.
Very good, thank you. Yeah, that's the gist of it. There are different features. The pro-inflammatory aspect is well documented. It has been shown to increase certain chemical messengers like interleukin 1 and 6 and 8, which cause inflammation. It also seems to induce a respiratory burst by the human neutrophils, which causes free radicals to be produced, which then can oxidize tissues and cause different sorts of damage. It also has an immunotoxic feature where they've fed it to rats in relatively high amounts, and it causes thymus atrophy. So the gland responsible for educating the white blood cells that are going to go out there and be the first line defense, when that gland atrophies, it profoundly adversely affects our immune function. It also generates autoimmunity. It's very difficult to differentiate between self and other when you have this very small molecule interacting with cells and actually acting on the nuclear level. So it's affecting the gene sequences and the phenotype of cells. It's actually causing a transformation of the cells' outer what are they called? Moieties, sort of like these sugars that give information to the immune cells. Well, this is the self. It may change those to look like it's the other. Let's see. So gene expression is part of it. Endocrine function. It's known that it can bind to the insulin receptor, and therefore would, in theory, either stimulate an insulin-like response, which could lead to hypoglycemia, or block out insulin, which is the hallmark feature of type 2 diabetes or insulin-resistant diabetes. It does have a particular affinity to thyroid tissue, and therefore has been shown to bind to benign and malignant thyroid nodules, which it also has a mitogenic effect. So you see this with the villi in the intestine when exposed to WGA. It actually causes a sloughing off of the cell, and it's very a rapid process, which can then lead to some damage. And then what I found to be maybe the most interesting feature is that to some degree it has a viral-like quality. It does seem to, again, enter the cell, the host cell. It does affect the genetic expression, which then can change the appearance of the cell, and it does definitely have the ability to accumulate in the body. So it's one of those things that, it's a very strange feature, but the WGA does present a problem. It appears
Let me ask you, you made mention before, and correct me if I heard you wrong, but of wheat or varieties of wheat actually developing this molecule
Yes.
as a tool to use against its major predator, which in this case would be humans.
Um, yeah, it appears that biotech has seized on a potential way to breed wheat where it would have higher levels of wheat germ agglutinin, or WGA, so that you wouldn't, in theory, have to spray it with pesticides. The same thing that was done with corn and soy, where they inserted the pesticide-producing gene from the bacteria Bacillus thuringiensis, and now corn and soy, most of it at least, conventionally grown, produces a pesticide. So I think the limiting feature there, though, is the acknowledgement that WGA is rather toxic, and so I've yet to see this go, into the marketplace, but I know that there's been research on this. Like they may actually think about doing this in the future.
Well, hopefully.
Yeah.
So what we're talking about wheat germ agglutinin, which is a lectin, and so there's another commonly known lectin in soy, phytohemagglutinin.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a relationship in the structure of these two molecules? Are they similar? What can you tell us about any kind of similarities or any because there are a lot of legumes and other foods that do contain lectin. So
you're correct. Yes. Well, as a category, I guess grains, beans, and nightshades are the most lectin rich. I don't know the specifics of the relationship. That's a great question, and that's something I'll be researching in the future. Because soy, I can say at least what seems to be true of soy is that it's diabetogenic, and this is true of corn, this is true of wheat, and there are a few other substances like peanuts. And the reason is because there's something in the lectin that has a certain affinity to cell types like pancreatic cells, and it is possible that because lectins are designed to shade the barrier between self and other, which is why they're so profoundly associated with autoimmunity, that both of these foods, being lectin-rich, are designed to adversely affect certain endocrine organs. So, they're called endocrine disruptors for that reason. And in other words, the pancreatic cell that produces insulin, the beta cell, when exposed to a lectin, may change its surface structure to such a degree that it's a red flag for the white blood cells to come and attack. And, one of the things that happens, it's quite multifactorial. Like with autoimmune diseases like juvenile onset type 1 diabetes, it could be something as simple as a viral infection or bacterial infection that stimulates this susceptibility. And the reason is because neuraminidase, or thiolidase it's called, which is what gives H1N1 its name, like hemagglutinin type 1, neuraminidase type 1. Well, they secrete that enzyme that breaks that protective coating down to sialic acid in a way that's probably very similar to the wheat lectin. And by exposing the N-acetylglucosamine beneath it, it's also known as the glycocalyx, that's what now makes those foods that they were already eating without having this immune-mediated problem just be able to attach directly to that underlying tissue and therefore causing these changes. So that's one reason why they say, starve a fever or a flu, because there's already this shearing off of the protective mucus coating. And that's another reason why you produce so much mucus when you're infected with a virus or bacteria as a protective coating. So that's why it's so tricky, because so many people will say, well, we've been eating this for centuries, it doesn't do any harm. But then you have a child, let's say 2 years old, who had a viral infection, and suddenly that wheat they've been eating for a year or more is the stimulus behind autoimmune self-destruction of things like pancreatic cells.
Now, how would you correlate this to, say, vaccination? Somebody
great.
taking a vaccination and then getting,
Absolutely.
having the response directly, because there's some that say that it's the mercury in the vaccine, but not all vaccines contain mercury, and of course there are other substances. I'm going to let you take over with that question.
Oh, I love it. Yeah, what a wonderful connection. Okay, because they actually use different types of they use the glutamic acid, for instance, as an adjuvant in vaccines, and wheat is so extraordinarily high in glutamic acid. It's a non-essential amino acid, it's what makes wheat taste so good because it's like monosodium glutamate. There's a specific receptor that the Japanese coined the term umami for that makes it taste good. The real fascinating thing I discovered about wheat was there is a molecular homology between the immunodominant sequence and the whooping cough pathogen known as pertussis, and it's called protactin. It's a 33 amino acid long sequence, and it's identical to a peptide found in wheat. It's a byproduct of digesting gliadin. And so this substance, which is actually put in vaccines as an adjuvant to stimulate an immune response, is actually found exactly in wheat. So, this is a separate issue from WGA, but they all work together because if WGA can penetrate the intestinal lining and maybe further stimulate intestinal permeability, and then you have gliadin, which actually is known to upregulate a protein known as zonulin, which opens up the junctures between the enterocytes in the intestine, causing further permeability. Then you flood the bloodstream with immunovirulent proteins. And the thing about common red wheat is that it is a hexaploid species. You have 3 sets of chromosomes, so you have a massive amount of genes that produce a massive amount of proteins. In fact, there's over, I think it's 23,000 proteins that have been identified in the wheat plant. So you can imagine what a nightmare that may lead to. All the antigenicity of these proteins floating around the blood. Body can't tell if it's a foreign bacteria. It can't tell, if it's a food. It's just quite amazing. So I think the vaccines participate in inciting autoimmunity, which would not necessarily occur if they're just eating wheat and they still have a healthy digestive system. One good example of this is a study I found, which is on GreenMedInfo, showing that celiac disease itself, the risk for it is dramatically reduced in children that are breastfed for the full, 6 months. Because, in America today, we, have one of the largest infant mortality rates in the developed world. I think 32 out of 33 nations. But only 11% of children are breastfed until age 6. But just simply by feeding them breast milk, the genetic disease, celiac disease, doesn't express itself as often. So there's definitely correlations here.
Wow. So let me just back up for a minute because there was a lot of technical speaking there. And I want to make sure that our listeners that don't have a background can understand. So what you're saying is basically in the vaccines there's a substance that mimics gliadin or is very similar to gliadin.
Yes.
And that in of itself, just like we know with the gluten, with the gliadin protein, it upregulates in our intestines the sequence of zonulin production, zonulin being a protein that was discovered to create leaky gut syndrome.
Yes.
So once we get a vaccine, by the ingredient in the vaccine actually creates a leaky gut or an intestinal permeability that then allows anyone who's eating extra grain to have an onslaught or a flood of these proteins that can contribute to a host of different types of autoimmune triggers, affect the thymus, which then dictates how sensitive the immune system is and can just basically trigger autoimmune disease. Is that?
Yeah, I think that would be accurate for the most part, is that there is a profound similarity between the adverse effects associated with vaccination and the adverse effect associated with eating wheat, that in many ways they almost result in the same problem. Because the principle, as you know, behind vaccination is try to induce a miniature version of disease without it really becoming full-blown. So you're still inducing an immune response, and it can very easily turn into an autoimmune response when you inject something directly into the vein. And that's kind of what's happening with these proteins in wheat that are actually opening up the gaps in the intestinal wall, letting in amino acid sequences that are far larger than our body is designed to handle, which, because they're not digested fully, have sequences that are almost identical to actual pathogens. And The main one being really Protactin, which is almost identical to the 33 amino acid long gliadin metabolite known as 33-mer.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very fascinating homology.
Now, have you seen anything in the literature about these same molecules creating a disruption in the blood-brain barrier? Because a lot of these kids are developing neurodevelopmental disease.
Yeah, that's what I found most fascinating about WGA, because as we were talking about, the fixation today really is on gliadin and gluten and all these different peptides, not on the lectin. Well, the lectin is actually so efficient as at getting through the blood-brain barrier that it's used as a neural tracer. Like if they're trying to map neural networks, they attach the WGA to some type of some marker. I think they use maybe like a Japanese horseradish enzyme. And they can trace the movement of the WGA very well because it just goes freely throughout the brain. There's no, right through the blood-brain barrier, and it just moves freely throughout the brain. So it is possible that is one mechanism behind why these very powerful pharmacologically active peptides known as gluten exorphins, I think there are 4 of them that have been identified, and then obviously gliadomorphin, which is the most famous opiate-like molecule, which is found in wheat. So these different components work well together, and it's quite amazing because it's truly as if wheat was not meant for human consumption, that it has so much going against it that would make it quite harmful. And it kind of explains why cultures traditionally consume things like sourdough, which enabled those proteins to be broken down more fully. What I found most fascinating about my studies on wheat germ agglutinin is it turns out that sprouted wheat and whole wheat is most wheat germ agglutinin rich. So this whole argument, which is really big in the health food industry, like Ezekiel sprouted bread from,
right.
It turns out that when you sprout the kernel, the seed, the WGA actually migrates to the root tips, which is exactly the interface where it would be dealing with bacteria and fungi in the soil, and then to the tips of the shoots, which then would be exposed to birds and maybe grazing cattle and humans. So even wheatgrass juice in that sense would have that additional liability. It would be gluten-free, obviously, which is why some people can handle it who are gluten sensitive, but it would still have WGA. And this WGA concentration continues to maintain pretty high levels for 30 days after it's been sprouted. And so it's
that's amazing. I see that all the time clinically in my patients that they bring me information about wheatgrass and other grain grasses and tell me that these are gluten free, so technically we can have them, but I always see them react. So
exactly, it's fascinating. There's also a lot of evidence surfacing post-Human Genome Project and post-Rodent Genome Project and post-Turkey Genome Project that they have the capability to break the seed stage of cereal grasses down far more efficiently than humans because they've had several 100,000 years longer time to adjust to that as a food source. As you know, the agrarian revolution occurred 10,000 years ago, and that's only 500 generations. And for some, like let's say the Eskimos, maybe one generation of time to adapt to a grain-based diet. So the lectin content, the WGA in particular, seems to block a receptor in the hypothalamus for leptin, which sounds like lectin, as you know, but that's the appetite-satiating hormone. Mm-hmm. So when you have leptin resistance, you may have insatiable appetite, which is also a hallmark of grain consumption.
Yeah, very, very commonly patients going on a grain-free diet will report back saying, I'm no longer hungry all the time. I can eat a very small amount of food, and I'm satisfied, and I don't have to eat more. So that's an interesting connection as well.
Yeah, it is true that the grain-based diet is just a roller coaster when it comes to the endocrine reactions they induce, and it definitely is true. Like the word bulimia means hungry like a cow. There's something about being a monogastric mammal that makes us maybe not so well suited for a grass-based diet. That it really does take a special, maybe 4-chambered stomach to sort of chew the cud and let it be fermented in intestinal tract that is many times longer than ours. So there is a company, New Chapter, that they formulated a Berry Green product, it's called, where they exclude explicitly the grasses for that reason. They focus on more of the vegetables we've co-evolved with, like cruciferous vegetables and certain herbs like parsley. And I personally have found quite a nice difference in that approach.
You said that was New Chapter?
Yeah, New Chapter makes
the
one.
Same company that makes Zyflamend?
Yes.
Yeah, that's a really good product as well.
Oh, I agree. Really wonderful product.
Okay, so tell me now a little bit about, there was a Bible reference I read in one of your papers, and I want to make the viewers and the listeners very well aware of kind of this take on what Genesis says. Can you kind of paraphrase that?
Yeah, it was basically following the expulsion from the Garden of Eden. God said to Adam and Eve something to the effect that they would be cursed and would have to eat bread, as a punishment, versus what might have been more like fruit from a fruit-bearing tree and maybe herbs. And so I always found that kind of fascinating because of references to grains as a staff of life and Jesus breaking bread and all these things. That the Old Testament might contain some real interesting clues as to our ancient diet, and I can't say I have the right interpretation, certainly no biblical scholar, but I did find that a fascinating passage.
I think
what's your take?
Well, I kind of agreed with you. I think that interpretation is where I lack as well. I'm also not a biblical scholar, but at the same time, I thought that that was pretty interesting, considering, like what you said, most churches use, if you're a Catholic, will use a wafer that is comprised of grain.
Yeah.
So I just find it kind of almost in a sense ironic that we can take something that potentially there's a reference to in the Bible that says maybe this isn't the best thing for us to eat, and then we could create something so big out of it, and give it to so many millions, hundreds of millions of people around the world, willingly.
You're correct. I know there was quite a lot of controversy there for a while because the Eucharist could only be a wheat cracker. That was something the Catholic authorities really stuck by, despite recognition of celiac disease. So it's pretty big, this perception that wheat is sort of the king of grains, and it's part of the United Nations. Their arm to defeat hunger has the wheat as the emblem, and their motto is "Let there be bread," and so it's definitely considered to be one of the best things for you. But my real passion is helping just everyone out there realize that, good Lord, well, maybe wheat really isn't beneficial to health. And it seems like wherever I turn in the research, there really is confirmation of that. And then over 7 years, just working with customers who've had a variety of complaints, when they walk in and they want to buy glucosamine for their joints, I'd love to point out to them that the reason why this works is that instead of the wheat germ agglutinin attaching to the tissue in your joints, causing inflammation, if you take a lot of this chitin, which is the exoskeleton of sea creatures like crabs, which is composed of linkages of N-acetylglucosamine, the wheat germ agglutinin, lectin, will attach to that glucosamine and not your own. And so there's a huge, huge market for glucosamine, but I think most people can just eliminate wheat and really see a profound difference.
I have seen that trend strongly in practice dealing with musculoskeletal issues. And I've also seen the trend, grains, by nature are not very high in omega-3 fats and actually provide more of the omega-6 variety. So there's also that correlation with the ratio of omega-3 to omega-6 fats in the diet. They actually did a study in the, I want to say it was the Journal of Neurological Surgery, and it was about a year ago where they put patients on NSAIDs, and they put another group of patients on omega-3 fat. And they actually concluded that omega-3 fat was more efficient at reducing pain.
Wow.
or just as efficient rather, as the NSAIDs were. So
Wow.
I think there's a grain correlation there with overconsumption of grain actually
Wow.
contributes to fatty acid ratio abnormalities. So there's just so many things that,
Yeah.
like what you're saying with WGA, like what you're saying with some of the other molecules that just point to grain not being a very good food for human consumption.
That's an excellent point. In fact, all the grains that I've analyzed, there's a nutrition data database through the USDA. It's about a 40-part omega-6 to a 1-part omega-3. And a lot of the research that's emerged shows that our prehistoric ratio was more like a 1-part omega-3 to 1-part omega-6, or maybe up to 1-part omega-3 to 4-part omega-6. Now, if you look at peanuts, for instance, there's 1,000 times more omega-6 than omega-3. And that leads, as you know, to the eicosanoid pathway, and that upregulates arachidonic acid, which is the fuel for cyclooxygenase and lipooxygenase, and then that spits out the leukotriene and prostaglandin and then thromboxane. It's amazing, but if we really do focus on the foundation of our diet and limit grain consumption and consume these omega-3 fatty acid-rich vegetables, like it's amazing, but broccoli and cauliflower, it's like a 1-to-1 ratio. Then we'll see dramatic changes in our health without having to be even dependent on palliative supplements.
Yeah, I would agree with that too. I'm a big believer in food being the medicine as opposed to supplements allowing you to give yourself the excuse to eat badly.
Yes, it's very true. That's great. Yeah. So.
Well, I greatly appreciate you coming on the phone.
Yeah.
Today to speak with me. It's been very enlightening, and I think we'll have a lot of good information to share with our audience. And, I think in the future, if you're open to it, I'd like to have you on again, and I think there's a lot more that we could touch on and talk on.
That'd be great pleasure. Yeah, I'm very honored to be on your show, and I think you're doing great work out there, and I look forward to following the Gluten Free Society website. I'll be pointing all my customers and colleagues to it.
Well, I appreciate that, and I'm going to put a link up to your site for all of our viewers and listeners to go and check out. I think I've been there myself. I think it's a great site. There's a lot of great information there that people can get that don't really realize they have access to. So
great. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, we'll be in touch soon. You have a nice evening.
All right, you too.
Thanks. Bye-bye.